Welcome to Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go. Our AI narration lets you delve into the wisdom of timeless books, extracting those golden nuggets of insight. What if the Roman Republic's fall, the one we always hear about as this huge tragedy?
Mm-hmm.
What if it wasn't so tragic after all?
Mm.
What if, and stick with me here, what if it was actually like a necessary step, a transformation maybe, into something even bigger and more influential?
Interesting. You're talking about the rise of the Roman Empire, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The empire that gave us so much, from lasting peace to a cultural legacy that still impacts us today. But to understand that shift, we need to dig a little deeper into the Republic story.
I'm game. Where should we start?
Let's go way back. Power struggles were there right from the beginning. Like, remember the assassination of Tarquin the Elder
Mm-hmm.
and how his wife, Tanaquil, totally maneuvered things to get Servius Tullius on the throne?
Yeah. It shows that even back then, succession wasn't always a clear-cut, following the rules kind of thing.
And get this, Cicero, centuries later, pointed out that Servius Tullius was actually the first Roman ruler who wasn't directly chosen by the patricians, the old aristocratic families.
That's a pretty big deal. It suggests that the grip of those families was already starting to loosen.
Totally. And Servius Tullius, he was a pretty savvy guy. He institutes the census, but instead of basing it on your family name or whatever, it was all about your wealth, like how much you had determined your civic duty and your standing in society.
Just someone who wasn't born into a powerful family, but had managed to, say, build a successful business,
Right.
they'd actually have a voice.
Right. And it shook things up even more when he created the equites. This new class, these were people wealthy enough to serve in the cavalry.
And they would have been loyal to the guy who gave them that status, right? Servius Tullius. They basically became this whole new power base to challenge the old aristocracy. Do we know when all of this was happening?
All of this is going down around 560 BC. Back then, Rome, with all its surrounding territory, probably had about 260,000 people.
Okay, so not a small town anymore.
But Servius Tullius wasn't done. He divides everyone into 35 tribes. But get this, it's based on where they live, not who their ancestors were. So again, he's taking power away from those old family lines.
It's like what Cleisthenes did in Attica, right? Breaking down the old power structures and letting everyday people have more of a say.
Bingo. And when his right to rule was challenged by another Tarquin, actually, what does Servius Tullius do? He calls for a vote. A plebiscite, they called it, and the sources say he got unanimous support.
Wow, that's like a huge acknowledgement of the people's power, even if it was a strategic move on his part.
Exactly. It set a precedent, showing that the people, even in this early stage, had a role to play in deciding who ruled them. But let's fast forward a bit.
Sounds good.
As time goes on, the plebeians, the common folks, they start demanding more say in how things are run. They create their own assemblies, like the Concilia Plebis, to discuss their concerns. And then, by 357 BC, they establish the Comitia Populi Tributa.
Okay, hold on. That's a mouthful. What was that last one?
The Comitia Populi Tributa was the tribal assembly of the people. And they eventually won the right to make laws that affected everyone, patricians included.
So the plebeians actually had a hand in creating the laws that govern them.
You got it. And their tribal assembly, it was a pretty revolutionary system for the time. Each tribe, remember, those were based on Servius Tullius's census by residents, each tribe got one vote.
Ah, so it didn't matter if you were rich or poor within a tribe, your vote carried the same weight. That's a big departure from, say, the Assembly of the Centuries, where wealth determined how much your vote counted.
Absolutely. It was all about where you lived, the collective voice of your community. And then in 287 BC, we get the Lex Hortensia, big moment. The Senate finally acknowledged that laws passed by the tribal assembly were binding on everyone, patricians too.
Wow. So the plebeians, after centuries of pushing for more rights, they finally had a real legislative body that could challenge the power of the Senate. No wonder some sources call that a triumph of Roman democracy.
Right. And by 200 BC, the tribal assembly had become the main source of Roman private law. Plus, they got to elect the tribunes. You remember them, the tribuni plebis?
Right, the guys dedicated to protecting the interests of the common people. They could veto the Senate, couldn't they?
Yeah, if they thought a decision would harm the plebeians, they had some serious power.
And being elected by the tribal assembly made them directly accountable to the people they represented.
But of course, it wasn't a perfect system. In the tribal assembly, there wasn't really any public debate. It was more like, here's the proposal, vote yes or no.
I see. So it was more about ratifying decisions than actually hashing things out in public.
Yeah.
Not exactly the kind of open forum we think of today.
And there was another big issue. Remember how the tribes were set up? Most of them, like 31 out of 35, represented rural areas.
Yeah.
So the urban population in Rome itself, which was growing all the time, they were squeezed into just 4 tribes.
Ah, so their voices were still kind of drowned out, even with the tribal assembly.
Yeah, their political clout was limited, at least until guys like Marius and Caesar came along later and saw an opportunity there.
Okay, so we've got the plebeians gaining power through the tribal assembly. But what about the Senate? Did they just fade into the background?
Not quite. They were pretty crafty about holding on to influence. For one thing, they used colonization to give land to some of the plebeians, which eased social pressures a bit. And more importantly, public office. All those fancy positions in government, they remained unpaid.
Ah, so if you were poor, you couldn't afford to serve even if you got elected. That automatically kept a lot of people out.
Exactly. Plus, the Senate was this elite club, full of experienced guys who held high office. They had prestige, institutional memory, and they served for life.
So a lot of the wealthy plebeians, once they had achieved political equality, they kind of like joined forces with the patricians to keep things stable.
Right. It was in their best interest, too. And think about the businessmen, the ones getting rich off government contracts and all that. They also wanted stability.
So it was this kind of oligarchy in the making where wealth and power, regardless of your family background, kind of solidified into a ruling class.
And don't forget the Assembly of the Centuries, the one that elected the top magistrates, who then went on to become senators. Their voting system still favored the aristocracy big time.
Right, so even though the plebeians had made gains with the tribal assembly, the Senate still had this way of keeping itself stocked with mostly aristocrats.
And even those consuls who came from plebeian families, once they got into the Senate, they often became more conservative. The whole atmosphere of the institution seemed to push them that way.
Makes sense. Lifetime membership in this exclusive club, surrounded by tradition and power. It would definitely shape your outlook.
And then things get really interesting. The Punic Wars start in 264 BC. This is a whole century of wars against Carthage, and Rome's very survival is at stake.
Talk about a pressure cooker.
Yeah, and in times of crisis, people tend to look to strong leadership. And the Senate, with all its experience and continuity, they basically took charge. The populace just went along with it.
Necessity breeds unity, or at least obedience.
Exactly. But let's rewind a bit further. Remember the Gallic invasion around 390 BC? Rome was actually sacked. The capital was besieged. They even had to pay 1,000 pounds of gold to get those Gauls to leave.
Ouch. Talk about a humiliating defeat. That must have left a scar on the Roman psyche.
It did. But it also forced them to improve their defenses and rethink their military strategy. And they eventually fought back, even conquering Cisalpine Gaul, which is basically northern Italy.
So they learned from their mistakes and came back stronger. That seems to be a recurring theme in Roman history.
Now, centuries later, Hannibal comes along and throws another wrench in the works. He invaded Italy and tried to get Rome's allies to rebel. But for the most part, it didn't work. The Italian states stayed loyal to Rome.
Interesting. Why do you think that was?
Well, Roman diplomacy was pretty effective. They'd built up a network of alliances that were actually mutually beneficial. The other Italian states saw the value in sticking with Rome, even when things were tough.
It's like they'd created this sense of shared destiny where everyone had a stake in Rome's success.
Exactly. And even Hannibal's Gallic allies, they started deserting him. He was counting on reinforcements from his brother Hasdrubal, but the Romans stopped them. Poor guy. He was a brilliant military strategist, but ultimately he was isolated.
Logistics matter. You can have the best battle plans in the world, but if you can't get supplies and reinforcements, you're in trouble.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about everyday life in Rome. Popular beliefs were a fascinating mix of animism, fetishism, magic, and all kinds of superstitions.
That's like my kind of party.
People believed in sacred objects, wore amulets for protection, and used charms and incantations. They were terrified of witches and curses. Even guys like Horace and Virgil, the great poets, they wrote about witches with the power to transform, poison, even raise the dead.
It makes you realize that fear of the unknown, that desire to explain the unexplainable, it's a universal human thing.
And it wasn't just limited to personal fears. Miracles and portents were taken very seriously, seen as messages from the gods, speaking statues, divine interventions in battle, lucky and unlucky days. Livy's histories are full of these accounts, and he presents them as fact.
So religion wasn't just a set of beliefs. It was woven into every aspect of their lives, from personal decisions to affairs of state.
Now, despite all that, the early republic had this reputation for political integrity, at least in theory. We hear stories about guys like Valerius Corvus and Curius Dentatus. They held high office but stayed poor, rejecting wealth and luxury.
These were the heroes of the Republic, right? They embodied those idealized Roman values of selfless service and incorruptibility.
Yeah, and even Fabius Pictor, the historian, he refused lavish gifts, saying it was his duty to serve the state without personal gain. There were even accounts of people lending money to friends without charging interest.
So that ideal of civic virtue, it wasn't just empty rhetoric. It was something they genuinely aspired to, at least in their personal lives.
But it's interesting, because when it came to foreign affairs, the Roman state wasn't always so virtuous.
Yeah, they could be pretty ruthless. Power politics and all that.
True. But there are these interesting contradictions. They refused to get involved in a plot to poison King Pyrrhus, their enemy. And after the Battle of Cannae, when Hannibal captured a bunch of Roman soldiers, they were so impressed by the prisoners' honorable conduct that they let them go free. It's a complicated picture.
It seems like Roman ethics were kind of a balancing act. They valued things like fides, which means faithfulness and loyalty, but they could also be incredibly pragmatic when it came to achieving their goals.
Absolutely. And speaking of changes, did you know that the Latin language was evolving too? Like the word for horse in all those Romance languages, caballo, cheval, cavallo, it all comes from the everyday word cabalus, not the formal equus you'd find in writing.
That's fascinating. So the language of the people, the way they actually spoke, it was shaping the future of Latin, even as the formal language stayed pretty much the same.
In early Roman literature, well, it wasn't exactly Shakespeare. Mostly religious hymns, songs about historical events, and records kept by priests. Even Fabius Pictor's history, written around 202 BC, was in Greek.
Wow. It really highlights the influence of Greek culture on Rome at that time. They hadn't fully developed their own literary tradition yet.
Yeah. But they did have these things called satirae, which were kind of like early forms of prose that mixed different genres together. They influenced later writers like Horace and Juvenal.
Kind of like proto-satire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there were the mimes and the histriones, these boisterous performances that were probably pretty crude. Think slapstick comedy and lots of improvisation.
Sounds fun. Were these homegrown Roman traditions?
Actually, they were probably brought over by Etruscan actors. Some scholars even think the word histrio, which means actor in Latin, comes from Istria, a region with Etruscan roots.
I love those little linguistic connections. It shows how interconnected cultures were, even back then.
And let's not forget the farces. These comedies, with their stock characters like the foolish old man, the love-struck youth, the clever slave, the glutton, and the clown. Some scholars even say the clown was a precursor to Punchinello.
Those archetypes are so timeless. You see them in comedies, across cultures, and throughout history. It makes you wonder about human nature, you know. The things we find funny, they seem to stay pretty consistent.
So true. And when it comes to astronomy, well, the Romans weren't exactly known for their scientific discoveries in this period. It was mostly astrology, trying to predict the future from the stars.
It's understandable, though. When you look up at the night sky, it's natural to try and find meaning in those patterns. We're hardwired to look for connections.
And medicine. Well, that was pretty basic, too. Mostly home remedies, magic spells, and prayers. They even had gods for specific illnesses. Like Febris was the goddess of fever, and Mephitis, believe it or not, was the goddess who protected you from mosquitoes.
Talk about specialization. It makes you wonder if they had gods for every little ailment.
They probably did. Healing shrines and sacred springs were popular, and the temple of Aesculapius, the god of healing, was a major center for people seeking cures.
It makes you wonder what those treatments were like. Probably a lot of herbal remedies and rituals.
Yeah, and there's evidence of slave doctors and even early dentistry. The 12 Tables, those early Roman laws, they even mention fines for burying gold that was used in dental work.
Okay, so dentistry was already a lucrative profession back then. Makes sense.
But the first known freeman physician, a guy named Archigathus, he didn't arrive until 219 BC. And get this, he was initially welcomed, but they nicknamed him Butcher because of his surgical techniques.
Ouch. Early surgery couldn't have been a pleasant experience. It's interesting, though, seeing those Greek medical influences starting to creep in.
Now, economically speaking, Rome was going through some major changes, too. Industrial production was pretty limited, mostly because transporting goods overland was so difficult. Waterways were essential.
Yeah, before the invention of trains and cars, moving large quantities of stuff was a logistical nightmare.
But the Romans, they were amazing engineers. They built this incredible network of roads, the consular roads, like the Via Lapina, the Via Appia, the Via Aurelia, the Via Flaminia, the list goes on.
Those roads were a game changer. They unified Italy, made trade easier, and allowed the Roman legions to march quickly wherever they needed to go. They were vital for Roman expansion.
And they were amazingly well built, too. Some of those roads are still around today. It's incredible.
A testament to Roman engineering.
Absolutely. Now, early banking, this is pretty interesting. The temples actually served as banks. Money lending was a common practice, and the 12 tables even set limits on interest rates, trying to curb usury.
So they were already dealing with the complexities of finance and trying to regulate things. Sounds familiar.
Yeah, the government even stepped in with debt relief measures from time to time. There was even a banker's row in the forum, where all the financial transactions went down. And then people took out loans for all sorts of things, from business ventures to, believe it or not, paying ransoms.
Paying ransom.
Yeah, if you were captured by pirates or something, you might need to take out a loan to get your freedom back.
Wow, talk about a high-stakes loan. It's amazing, though, how sophisticated their financial systems were becoming.
And they even had cooperative lending and joint stock companies called public canny that financed big government projects. Pretty advanced for the time.
Yeah, you can see the seeds of modern capitalism there.
Now, as Rome's power grew, they started getting more involved in the affairs of other countries, especially Greece. By 146 BC, they'd basically conquered all of Greece.
The end of an era for Greek independence, a turning point in Mediterranean history.
It was. The sack of Corinth by the Roman general Mummius, that was a pretty brutal symbol of Roman dominance.
So Rome was becoming an empire, in all but name.
And back in Rome itself, society was changing too. Wealthy women were gaining more influence. Prostitution was on the rise, and there's evidence that homosexual relationships were becoming more common as well.
Interesting how those social changes often go hand in hand with economic prosperity. When people have more wealth and leisure time, traditional values sometimes start to shift.
Cato the Elder, he was this old-school Roman senator, he famously complained that women were starting to rule over men. He was particularly concerned about the Oppian Law, which was supposed to limit how much jewelry and fancy clothes women could wear. They actually protested and got it repealed.
Sounds like an early feminist movement. It shows that women were becoming more assertive and demanding a greater role in public life.
And then you have the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. They tried to implement some pretty radical reforms, things like redistributing land to the poor and giving grain to the needy.
They were trying to address those growing inequalities that we talked about earlier. The gap between rich and poor was getting wider, and that always leads to social unrest.
Exactly. And the Gracchi brothers, they paid the price for their idealism. Tiberius was assassinated in 133 BC by a mob of senators who saw him as a threat to their power.
Classic case of the establishment resisting change, even when it was clearly needed. It's tragic how often that happens throughout history.
And after Tiberius was killed, his brother Gaius took up the mantle of reform. He also met a violent end, committing suicide after being declared an enemy of the state.
These guys were ahead of their time. They recognized the problems that were brewing in Roman society, but the entrenched interests were too powerful.
And then Sulla comes along. He was a general who seized power and basically became a dictator. He implemented a whole bunch of reforms, known as the Cornelian Laws, that were designed to strengthen the power of the aristocracy and roll back a lot of the progress the plebeians had made.
Sulla was a fascinating figure, ruthless and ambitious, but also a shrewd politician. He understood how to use power to achieve his goals, and he wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty.
He enfranchised provincials and former slaves, but he did it partly to weaken the voting power of the existing assemblies in Rome. He also limited grain distribution, gave land to his veteran soldiers, and basically tried to put the Senate back in control.
So he was using populist measures to achieve an aristocratic agenda. Pretty clever and cynical.
Now, the late Republic, this is where things get really messy. It was a time of incredible wealth, but also rampant corruption and violence.
The spoils of empire were flowing back to Rome, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. Generals, politicians, businessmen, they were all scrambling for power and riches.
Generals like Lucullus, Pompey, and Caesar, they were amassing huge fortunes from their conquests in the provinces. The publicani, the tax collectors, were squeezing every last drop out of the people they ruled, and Roman financiers were lending money at exorbitant interest rates, basically enslaving entire communities.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster. When you have that much wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, and so much poverty and resentment among the masses, something has to give.
And it did. In 63 BC, we get the Catiline conspiracy. This guy, Catiline, he was a disgruntled aristocrat who tried to overthrow the government with an army of rebels.
He was basically the poster boy for Roman decadence and ambition, a fascinating and dangerous character.
Cicero, who was consul at the time, he exposed the plot and had Catiline and his followers executed. It was a dramatic episode that really highlights the political instability of the late Republic.
Cicero was a complex figure, brilliant orator, dedicated public servant, but also vain and ambitious. He saw himself as the savior of the Republic, and in many ways he was right. He stopped Catiline's coup, but he couldn't stop the rot that was eating away at the foundations of Roman society.
And amidst all this political turmoil, there were huge shifts happening in religion, too. Traditional Roman religion was losing its hold on the educated classes. Some people were openly skeptical, while others were turning to Eastern mystery cults that promised salvation and a better afterlife.
Yeah, the old gods were losing their appeal. People were looking for something more personal, more spiritual.
And there's even evidence of a growing belief in a literal hell, Tartarus, they called it. This wasn't part of traditional Roman religion, but it was becoming more popular, probably due to the influence of Eastern cults.
It makes you wonder if the violence and uncertainty of the times made people more receptive to those darker ideas about the afterlife. When your world is falling apart, it's natural to think about what might happen after you die.
And then you have Epicureanism, a philosophy that basically said the soul didn't exist and there was no afterlife. Lucretius, the poet, he was a big proponent of this. It was a pretty materialistic view of the world, and it appealed to people who were disillusioned with traditional religion.
It was a reaction against superstition and fear. The Epicureans basically said, look, there's no point in worrying about what happens after you die. Just enjoy life while you can.
Cicero, though, he was still a believer in the old gods, even though he was also influenced by Greek philosophy. He actually wrote a whole book arguing for the restoration of traditional Roman religion.
So you've got this tension between those who wanted to go back to the old ways and those who were embracing new ideas, whether it was skepticism, Eastern mysticism, or philosophical materialism. It was a time of great intellectual ferment.
And Varro, he was a scholar who wrote a huge encyclopedia about Roman civilization. He was trying to preserve the knowledge and traditions of the past, maybe because he sensed that they were slipping away.
It's like he was creating a time capsule, trying to capture the essence of Roman culture before it vanished completely.
Now, Cicero, besides being a politician and philosopher, he was also a prolific letter writer. And his letters, they're a goldmine of information about his personality and private life. You get to see the man behind the public persona.
What's he like in his letters?
Well, he's brilliant, witty, insightful, but he can also be vain, gossipy, even a bit neurotic. He loves to complain about his rivals, and he's always bragging about his accomplishments.
Sounds like a real human being with all his flaws and contradictions.
Exactly. And he was super wealthy, too. He owned all these fancy villas, which is kind of ironic, considering he was always preaching about simple living and virtue.
Ah, the hypocrisy of the elite. It's a tale as old as time.
And speaking of hypocrisy, let's talk about Brutus. He's the guy who famously led the conspiracy to assassinate Julius Caesar.
A2, Brute, the ultimate betrayal.
But his motives were actually pretty complex. He wasn't just some idealistic Republican who wanted to save Rome from tyranny. He was also motivated by personal ambition, family history, and maybe even a bit of jealousy.
So it wasn't as black and white as it's often portrayed.
No, it was a messy situation. Brutus came from a long line of Romans who had opposed kings, so he felt like he was upholding a family tradition. And he was close to Caesar, but he was also worried that Caesar was becoming too powerful and might try to make himself king.
So he was torn between loyalty and duty, a classic Shakespearean dilemma.
And his wife, Portia, she was a strong woman who was totally involved in the conspiracy. There's a story about how she deliberately cut herself to prove her strength and trustworthiness to Brutus.
Wow, that's hardcore. It shows how high the stakes were. These people were risking their lives for what they believed in.
And ultimately, the assassination of Caesar didn't save the Republic. It just plunged Rome into another civil war between Antony and Octavian, Caesar's heir.
Yeah, sometimes even the best intentions can have unintended consequences. And in this case, those consequences were devastating.
And it's interesting because during all this turmoil, Virgil, the great poet, he wrote the Aeneid, which was basically a propaganda piece for Octavian. He presented Octavian as the chosen one, destined to bring peace and prosperity to Rome.
It's amazing how art and literature can be used to shape public opinion, even in ancient times. The Aeneid is still considered one of the greatest works of Roman literature, but it's also a product of its time, reflecting the political realities of the day.
And Octavian, he was a shrewd politician. He knew how to play the game. He eventually defeated Antony and became the first emperor of Rome, Augustus.
The end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. a turning point in history.
Augustus, he was really good at consolidating power while still maintaining the appearance of republican institutions. The Senate still met, they still passed laws, but everyone knew who was really in charge.
It was a clever strategy. He appeased the traditionalists while also creating a new system of government that was more centralized and efficient.
He held a bunch of consulships himself, and he subtly controlled the elections. Traditional offices, like the tribunate, they lost a lot of their power.
So he was slowly but surely dismantling the old Republican system from within.
And his financial reforms were pretty impressive. He introduced new taxes, reorganized the state finances, and even created two separate treasuries, one for the state and one for his own personal funds.
Talk about separating your personal and professional expenses, but seriously, it shows how he was centralizing financial control, which is always key to consolidating power.
And he wasn't just a financial wizard. He also understood the importance of religion for social stability. He became Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Roman religion, and he revived a lot of traditional cults and festivals.
So he was appealing to people's sense of tradition and piety. After all the chaos of the civil wars, people were yearning for stability and a return to the old ways.
And the literature of the Augustan age, it reflects this new era. You have Virgil with his epic poem about the founding of Rome, Horace with his witty satires about Roman society, Ovid with his love poems, and Livy with his monumental history of Rome.
It was a golden age for Roman literature. These writers were not only talented, but they were also supported by the patronage of Augustus and his circle. They helped to create a sense of national identity and pride in Roman achievements.
The early empire, though, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Augustus was succeeded by his stepson Tiberius, who was a bit of a recluse and not very popular.
Power can be a heavy burden. Not everyone is cut out for it.
And then you have Caligula, who was basically insane, Claudius, who was a bit of a bumbling scholar, and Nero, who was a tyrant and a megalomaniac.
Yeah, the Tulio-Claudians, they had their share of problems. It shows that even the most carefully crafted system of government can be vulnerable to the whims of individual rulers.
But even with those crazy emperors, the empire functioned pretty well. The bureaucracy was efficient, the army was disciplined, and the economy was generally prosperous.
And the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, that was a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity for the Mediterranean world.
But even during the Pax Romana, there were cracks starting to show. The emperors were becoming more and more autocratic, the Senate was losing its power, and the gap between rich and poor was widening.
Plus, you had those pesky barbarians at the borders, always causing trouble.
The rise of Christianity, that was another major development that would have huge consequences for the Roman Empire.
Yeah, it started as a small, obscure sect in Judea, but it spread like wildfire throughout the empire.
Philo of Alexandria, he was a Jewish philosopher who tried to reconcile Judaism with Greek philosophy. He developed this idea of the logos, which would later become a central concept in Christian theology.
It's fascinating how ideas can travel across cultures and be reinterpreted in new ways. Philo is trying to bridge the gap between two very different worldviews, and in doing so, he helped to lay the groundwork for a new religion that would transform the world.
Pergamum, that was a major city in Asia Minor. It was a center of learning and culture. They had a famous medical school, the Asclepium, where Galen, the most famous doctor of antiquity, studied.
So even as Roman power was spreading, Greek culture was still hugely influential. It was a fusion of ideas and traditions.
And there were all these wandering preachers and prophets, both pagan and Jewish, who were spreading new ideas and challenging the status quo. Apollonius of Tyana, he was a pagan mystic who supposedly performed miracles and had a large following.
It was a time of spiritual seeking, with people searching for meaning and purpose in a world that was rapidly changing.
And the Jews, they were looking for a Messiah, a savior who would deliver them from Roman rule. There were all these apocalyptic texts circulating, like the Book of Daniel and the Book of Enoch, that predicted the end of the world and the coming of God's kingdom.
Those messianic expectations, they created a climate of hope and anticipation, but also of potential unrest. The Romans were always wary of anyone who might challenge their authority, especially if they had a large following.
And then, of course, you have Jesus. He was born in Judea under Roman rule, and he preached a message of love, forgiveness, and the coming kingdom of God.
His teachings were radical and subversive. He challenged the religious authorities of his day, and he spoke truth to power.
He was arrested and crucified by the Romans, but his followers believed that he rose from the dead and ascended to heaven.
And that belief in the resurrection, that was the foundation of Christianity. It gave his followers hope that even in death, there was the promise of eternal life.
The early Christian movement, it spread quickly, first among Jews and then among Gentiles, non-Jews. Peter and Paul, they were two of the most important early Christian leaders, and they had different ideas about how to spread the message of Jesus.
Peter, he focused on the Jewish community, while Paul, he took the message to the Gentiles. He was a real pioneer, traveling all over the Roman Empire and establishing new churches.
Paul, he wrote a bunch of letters, epistles that became part of the New Testament. He developed some key Christian doctrines, like the idea of atonement through Christ's death and the concept of original sin.
Paul was a brilliant theologian. He took the basic teachings of Jesus and developed them into a coherent system of belief that could appeal to a wider audience.
And the early Christians, they had a pretty strict moral code.
Mhm.
They believed in monogamy, charity, and pacifism.
They were trying to create a new way of life based on the teachings of Jesus, a community that was set apart from the materialism and violence of Roman society.
But they were also persecuted by the Romans, who saw them as a threat to their authority.